Yes, good evening to our listeners and viewers of Dominica's broadcasting station. Right now, we're reporting live at the Fort Young Hotel for the University of the West Indies Global Campus Dominica and the Fort Young Hotel and Dive Resort presentation of the 13th Annual Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture. The theme is Freedom We Making, Lessons from the Grenada Revolution in 1979 to 1983. Our presenter tonight will be Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, Deputy Director, Global Campus Sites. Of course, what we can expect for tonight's program. The chair will be Dr. Kimon Joseph, who is a UE Global Campus 2020 head, UE Global Campus Dominica. We expect the national anthem by Mr. Daryl Bob, as well as invocation by Father Nigel Karam. Welcome remarks from Dr. Kimon Joseph. Collaborators remarks by Mr. Delwyn James. Introduction of the presenter by Miss Keria John Baptist. Lecture by Dr. Nicole Phillip. Just a little bit of background information on Dr. Nicole Philip Dow. She is the Deputy Director of UE Global Campus Sites. She joined the UE team as the head of the Grenada site in 2014. She earned her bachelor's, MPhil, and PhD in the history from UE St. Augustine, and she has also served in the field of education for over 30 years. She was a teacher at the St. Joseph Convent, senior lecturer, and she was also Dean of the Department of Art Sciences and Professional Studies at TA Marishaw Community College and part-time lecturer at St. George's University. So she's also an author, so we can expect a lot of information coming from this esteemed doctor here. Of course, we'll have an open discussion, then a vote of thanks by Miss Nadia Revere. So again, this is the 13th annual Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture, a collaboration between the University of the West Indies Global Campus, Dominica, and the Fort Young Hotel and Dive Resort.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, good evening, good evening. I think it is time for us to go ahead and make our start. All right. So, Dr. Francis Sever, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of UWI Global Campus. Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, Deputy Director, Global Campus Sites. Mrs. Sandra Griffith Carrington, Alumni Officer, UE Global Campus. Father Nigel Karam, Dean of Our Lady of Fairhaven Cathedral. Mr. Delwyn James, Events and Retail Manager, Fort Young Hotel and Dive Resort, and the staff of Fort Young Hotel. members of the executive of the UWI Alumni Association Dominica chapter, members of the executive of the UWI Global Campus Guild of Students, members of my own staff from UWI Global Dominica, students, alumni, and friends of UWI Global Campus, both here at Fort Young Hotel, and those joining us live via DBS Radio and Kyrie FM, media representatives, everyone, good evening, and welcome to our 13th annual Dame Eugenia Childs Memorial Lecture. This evening, our topic will be Is Freedom We Making? Lessons from the Grenada Revolution, 1979 to 1983. And our presenter is Dr. Nicole Philip Dow. My name is Dr. Kimoon Joseph. I'm head at UWI Open Campus, and I will be your chair for this evening. And we're about to start. I now invite Mr. Daryl Bob, who is an alum of St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies from 2006, who is also the secretary and currently acting as PRO for the Dominica Calypso Association, to lead us in the national anthem. Mr. Bob. Everyone, please stand.
I love beauty, I love splendor, I'll too also sweet and fair. All must surely gaze in wonder at thy gifts so rich and rare. Rivers, valleys, hills, and mountains, all these gifts we do extol. Healthy land so like all fountain, giving cheer that warms the soul. Dominica, God hath blessed thee with a clime benign and bright, pastures green and flowers of beauty, filling all with pure delight. And a people strong and healthy, full of godly, reverent fear. May we ever seek to praise thee for this gift so rich and rare. Come ye forward, sons and daughters of this gem beyond compare. Strive for honor, sons and daughters, do the right, be firm, be fair. Toil with hearts and hands and voices, we must prosper, sound the call, in which everyone rejoices, all for each and each for all.
Thank you, Mr. Bob. We don't normally clap after our national anthem, but that was lovely. Thank you very much, Mr. Bob. All right, I now invite Father Nigel Karam, who is the Dean of Our Lady of Fairhaven Cathedral, who is a graduate from St. Augustine campus from 2008, to lead us in the opening prayer. Father Karam.
Let us first of all listen to a text of Holy Scripture from the prophet Isaiah. In the days to come, the mountain of the temple of the Lord shall tower above the mountains and be lifted higher than the hills. All the nations will stream to it. Peoples without number will come to it, and they will say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. Since the law will go out from Zion, and the oracle of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will wield authority over the nations, and adjudicate between many peoples. These will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into sickles. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither shall there be any training for war. O house of Jacob, come, Let us walk in the light of the Lord. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. God of all wisdom and authority, you founded the earth in harmony and peace, establishing right relationships and giving just laws. As we gather here tonight, fill your people with a hunger and thirst for righteousness, justice, and peace. May we build homes, cities, and nations that are faithful to your plan and design. Give to your people discerning hearts to know right from wrong and good from evil. Lead us to act and work not only for our self-interest, but for the common good and welfare of all, especially the most vulnerable. We thank you for Dr. Nicole Philip Dow and her valuable research that can help us to learn lessons for building a more free, fair, and equitable society. Enlighten the minds and hearts of those who make our laws, enact them, and govern our region. May they not abuse their responsibility nor take advantage of their positions, but may they serve diligently and justly all the people. We pray in particular for the talks that will take place in St. Vincent tomorrow regarding the border between Venezuela and Guyana. May all parties respect each other and international law. We make our prayer in the name of Jesus, our Savior and Lord, who reigns above all forever and ever. Eternal rest grant unto Eugenia Charles, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon her. May she rest in peace. Amen.
Thank you, Father. You may have your seats. And in addition to my role as chair, I am also charged with giving the welcome remarks on behalf of the University of the West Indies Global Campus, Dominica. So I will go ahead and do so. So good evening again to everyone. It is certainly a delight for me to welcome all of you to this 13th annual Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture. Tonight is special for more than one reason. Firstly, of course, we are back at Fort Young Hotel with a lecture series for the first time since Hurricane Maria. Yes, you can clap. It's really wonderful. It certainly feels good to be back here again after such a long time. Delwyn and Mr. Nassif, as good friends often say when they have not visited in a while, I love what you've done with the place, okay? And so we are very happy to be here. Very good job. Secondly, tonight is special because this lecture series itself is back for the first time since February 2020. When Dr. June Sumer presented for us at the auditorium in UWI, back then, we had no idea that just 6 short weeks later, the whole world would have been brought to its knees by the pandemic, and that gatherings like this would be completely suspended for an extended period of time. Thirdly, during the last lecture presentation, we were fortunate to have Dr. Francis Sevre in Dominica, and he served as chair of that lecture with Dr. Sumer. He was director of country sites then. Tonight, we are glad that his schedule allowed for Dr. Sevre to be with us here again for this lecture. This time, he is here not as director, but as the principal of UWI Global Campus. Can we please clap for our principal? Welcome home, sir. Tonight's presentation of the 13th annual Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture will be done by Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, who is the Deputy Director of the UWI Global Campus sites. Dr. Philip Dow is from Grenada, and she's visiting Dominica for her very first time. And so, I'll be grateful if you would all join me in giving her a welcome clap. Dr. Philip Dow We trust that you will have a wonderful stay in Dominica with us this week, and we look forward in you coming back again and again, and of course in you staying at Fort Young again and again and again. Our site in Dominica hosts 4 public lecture series each year, and our main aim for these lectures is to allow the public speakers, researchers, and scholars from various disciplines of academia, the arts, and civil society to share their work and ideas with members of the public who in turn actively participate by listening to the topics and posing questions to the presenters. Tonight, Dr. Philip Dow joins Professor Eugene Barito, Professor Alan Cobley, Professor Vereen Shepherd, Sir James Mitchell, Sir Brian Aline, Dr. Tennyson Joseph, Professor Margaret Rose Jones, Miss Cynthia Barrow Giles, Professor Brian Meeks, Dr. Wendy Grenada, Dr. Francis Severe, and Dr. June Sumer as a presenter of the Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture. We are eager to hear about your research and your thoughts on the topic of the Grenada Revolution's aims and plans, its successes and failures, and what we all can learn from it. Dr. Philip Dow, I look forward to you dispelling some of the myths and giving us a real picture of this time of great contradictions, and I'm stealing from A Tale of Two Cities here, in not only Grenadian but Caribbean history. We at the Dominica site are wrapping up the first semester of the academic year 2023-2024. This new academic year has birthed a rebranding of our UE campus from open to global. Dominica site is committed to the university's vision of expanding our access to this excellent global university rooted in the Caribbean. We look forward to the exciting things ahead for both our site and the campus. This entire year, 2023, has been one of celebration for us because we joined the rest of the university community in celebrating our 75th anniversary. At the start of the year, Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit signed the declaration that announced the 7th of January as UWI Day. We also celebrated an interfaith service at Truth and Grace Fellowship Global Church. In addition, we held our tree planting and tree dedication ceremony in April, and we were joined by our neighbors, Comité pour Études Créoles, Roseau Primary School, and the Division of Forestry. We were also joined by the family of the late Dr. Violet Coffey, who we dedicated our Bois Motel to. She had worked with our campus on several cultural projects. In May, Dominica produced a video that highlighted our national dish, the callaloo, as part of a series called UE Across the Region, a Cooking Showcase. In October, we hosted 2 anniversary events: the joint induction ceremony for our Guild of Students Executive and our Alumni Association Executive, as well as the Eoli Blah Memorial Lecture. As December wraps up this year's celebrations, our Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture tonight, as well as Friday's recognition of graduate ceremony for the graduating class of 2023, will conclude our festivities for the 75th anniversary. Tonight's lecture is possible because of our collaboration with Fort Young Hotel and Dive Center. I know that someone else will give the vote of thanks later, but I wish to express my gratitude to Mr. Delwyn James, Events and Retail Manager, who has been working with us to secure this partnership. UWI is proud of the relationship that we have built with Fort Young Hotel over the years, and we look forward to many more events and programs together. I also want to thank my team at the Dominica site for their unwavering support and their dedicated service. As I always tell them, we are small, but we are strong. I am grateful for the support of the executives of the Guild of Students and the Alumni Association who have recently started their terms of service but have certainly hit the ground running. Once again, I welcome everyone here tonight. I look forward to a lively discussion after Dr. Dow's presentation. Thank you very much and welcome again to everyone. I now invite Mr. Delwyn James, who is the Events and Retail Manager at Fort Young Hotel and Dive Resort, who is also an alum of UWI Global Campus 2020. Delwyn? Give Delwyn a little clap of encouragement.
Dr. Francis Sevre, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal, UE Global Campus. Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, Deputy Director, Global Campus Sites. Dr. Kimon Joseph, Head UE Global Campus Dominica and staff of UB Global Campus Dominica. Mrs. Sandra Griffith Carrington, Alumni Officer, UE Global Campus. Father Nigel Karam, Dean, Our Lady of Fairhaven Cathedral. Members of the executive of the UE Alumni Association Dominica Chapter. Members of the executive of the UWI Global Campus Guild of Students, students, alumni, and friends of UE Global Campus, both here at the Fort Young tonight, and those listening via DBS Radio and Kyrie FM. On behalf of the Fort Young family, I am here to welcome you this evening to our property, the Fort Young Hotel and Dive Resort, for yet another interesting lecture organized in collaboration with the University of the West Indies. We at the Fort Young Hotel are elated about once again being the host for such a historical series. Fort Young has long been a partner for lectures such as these, and are thrilled to be back on board with the university to bring you the 13th annual Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture since the passage of Hurricane Maria and the dreadful COVID-19 pandemic. We have since reimagined the Fort Young by building back better and stronger for you. You are welcome to enjoy our new Fort Block facilities to include our new room accommodations, retail shop, wine and rum cellar, curated art gallery, and museum cafe, and coming in 2024, our state-of-the-art auditorium. As we continue to bring more to you, we look forward to continued collaboration with the University of the West Indies as we believe in the education and empowerment of our people. It is our hope that whatever is shared tonight by Dr. Dow inspires us all and creates healthy and meaningful discussions. Welcome once again.
Thank you very much, Delwyn. And we are going to move right ahead. And Miss Karaya John Baptiste, who is the Deputy Chair of our Alumni Association Dominica Chapter, who is a graduate of the University of the West Indies Global Campus 2022, is coming to read the bio of our presenter, and then Dr. Dow will have the floor. Karaya?
Dr. Francis Sevre, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal, UE Global Campus. Dr. Nicole Philippe Dow, Deputy Director, Global Campus Site. Dr. Kimon Joseph, Head, UE Global Campus Dominica, and the staff of the UE Global Campus Dominica. Mrs. Sandra Griffith Carrington, Alumni Officer, UE Global Campus. Father Nigel Karam, Dean, Our Lady of Fairhaven Cathedral. Mr. Delwyn James, Events and Retail Manager, Fort Young Hotel and Dive Resort, and the staff of the Fort Young Hotel. Members of the executive of the UE Alumni Association, Dominica Chapter. Members of the executive of the UE Global Campus Guild of Students. Students, alumni, and friends of the UE Global Campus, both here and at the Fort Young Hotel, and those listening live via DBS and Kyrie FM, media representatives, good evening. Dr. Nicole Philippe Dow is a Deputy Director, UE Global Campus Sites. She joined the UE team as head of Grenada site in 2014. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts, Master's of Philosophy, and her PhD in History from UE St. Augustine. Nicole has served in the field of education for over 30 years. She was a teacher at St. Joseph's Convent, senior lecturer and dean of the Department of Arts, Science, and Professional Studies at T.A. Marichaud Community College, and a part-time lecturer at St. George's University. Nicole has authored, co-authored, and co-edited 6 books, including Women in Grenadian History 1783 to 1983, 2010, Perspectives on the Grenada Revolution 1979 to 1983, that's in 2017, Caribbean Social Studies Book 2 and 3, 2018, and Collins History of Trinidad and Tobago, Forms 1, 2, and 3, 2002, and Collins Junior History of Grenada, 2003. In 2011, she attained the UE St. Augustine's 50 Distinguished Alumni Award. In 2013, she attained the UE Press best-selling scholarly monograph for her book, Women in Grenadian History 1783 to 1983. Nicole is the Deputy Chair of the Grenada National Reparations Commission. She provides community service by giving lectures and talks on history and culture. She's an academic, author, mother, and active member of her church community. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening I present to you Nicole Philippe Dow.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Are you hearing me loud and clear? Wonderful. Dr. Francis Severin, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of UWI Global Campus. My dear friend, Dr. Kimon Joseph, Head of UE Global Campus Dominica, and the staff at the Dominica site, most of whom I met today. Also my good friend, Mrs. Sandra Griffith Carrington, Alumni Officer of UE Global Campus, Father Nigel Karim, Dean of Our Lady of Fairhaven Cathedral, Mr. Delwyn James, Events and Retail Manager of Fort Young, members of the executive of UE Alumni Association Dominica Chapter, and members of the executive of UE Global Campus Guild of Students, friends, well-wishers, stakeholders, ladies and gentlemen, warm and fraternal greetings from, I would sound like Morris, the freedom-loving people of Grenada, but I will refrain from saying that. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you. This is my first trip to Dominica, so it's extra special, and because Grenada Revolution is so close to my heart, this lecture is even more special. It's Freedom We're Making is the title of a book written during the revolution. It epitomizes the ideals of the revolutionary government. It speaks to the idea that taking power by the non-traditional route of usurpation and force, their actions was geared towards the creation of freedom, towards the creation of a space, as Maurice Bishop defined it, and I quote, "This revolution is for work, food, shelter, education, and decent medical services for our children and our grandchildren," unquote. 40 years later, the question is, did the 1979 to 83 revolution attain its objective of making freedom? And what lessons can we learn from the processes, the programs, and unfortunately the demise of the Grenada Revolution? George Brezan, an economist and former Prime Minister of Grenada, used the adage "island of conflict" as the name of his seminal work on Grenada's history. And Brezan was not very far off the mark in his utterances, because this small Caribbean island of only 100,000 people has seen 3 revolutions in just under 200 years: 1795, 1951, and 1979. On each occasion, there was a proverbial cry for freedom from varying forms of oppression: religious intolerance, social discrimination, and political reprisals. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We need to look back a little before we go forward. Paternalism can be examined as an instrument of the revolutionary construct. The cry for freedom, or the call for radical transformation, is taken by a few who seek to meet the needs of many, oftentimes without the input or limited assistance from the masses or the people they claim to represent. In the 1795 revolution, Julien Fedor and his French free-colored, free black, and white colleagues took up arms to overturn British rule and replace it with a pro-republican French one. The intent was to right the wrongs of social, religious, and political injustices they had suffered. The revolution was planned in secret, with little or no input from the enslaved. Were the enslaved asked to join, since the force of their numbers made sense in offensive against the British? It was difficult to see Fedon, the property owner, changing the economic model of the island if the revolutionary battle had gone in his favor. As to whether he would have used a similar model like Toussaint in Haiti to ensure freedom of the enslaved, as well as economic prosperity of the new state, remains unanswered. Next slide, darling. In 1951, Eric Gary sought to redress the disenfranchised and marginalized through the formation of a trade union and a political party. His successes went a long way towards empowering the masses in the attainment of improved working conditions and living conditions, as well as a political voice in the affairs of the state. In less than 2 years, Gary had achieved what no Grenadian leader had achieved before: the creation of an effective trade union organization that united town and country workers, and the transformation of trade union power into political power. He had attained this feat as one of the working class and not a member of the middle class, as was the case in other Caribbean colonies at the time. Although Gary solicited the support of the masses, over time he sought to transfer the paternalistic hold of the plantation owner and British government over to himself, thereby consolidating power in himself as the ultimate leader. This transfer was explicit in his repeated acts of political malfeasance, including the 1962 misappropriation of government funds, or affectionately called squandermania in Grenada, control of associations like the Nutmeg and Cocoa Association, violence and victimization, and the use of henchmen or the Mongoose Gang to carry out atrocities against his opponents. Next slide, darling. Most notable was his violence against members of the New Jewel movement. On the 18th of November, 1973, Bloody Sunday, and the murder of Rupert Bishop, the father of Maurice Bishop, on the 21st of January, 1974, or Bloody Monday. By 1975, Gary had initiated the Newspaper Amendment Act, which increased the deposit needed to publish a newspaper. The act, in effect, was intended to silence the opposition parties. Opposition parties were also banned from using public address systems for the 1976 elections. And in 1978, the Essential Services Act placed limitations on trade unions' ability to use strike action. Next slide. In 1979, it was the Grenadian educated middle class, mainly from urban areas, that led this process of making freedom. Maurice Bishop, Bernard Cord, Kenrick Radix, Eudison Whiteman were all university-educated, predominantly urban middle-class men. They formed the urban core of the new Jewel movement. They sought to provide leadership in a struggle against the vestiges of colonialism, as epitomized by Gary's regime, and towards the development of a new alternative to development. The 1979 revolution, like its 1795 predecessor, was planned in secret with little input from the masses. Within the specific context of Grenada, this is the only possibility for the successful seizure of power. We have a tendency to talk a lot. You can't keep secrets in Grenada. Popular support was gained with people as followers of the revolutionary process rather than as equals. Maurice Bishop, in a speech given in 1982, speaks of this paternalistic benevolence, and I quote, "So what we did in their best interest, even though they did not necessarily understand why we were doing what we were doing," unquote. This, however, does not take into account the relative popularity and the grassroots base of the revolution. Professor Brian Meeks, in speaking of his own experience in revolutionary Grenada, described what he called, quote, "tangible revolutionary spirit that inspired the beginning of a cultural revolution and raised the self-esteem of ordinary Grenadians at home and abroad." Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just pausing a little bit for you to have a little look at revolutionary Grenada based on the pictures that you can see. So that's Maurice at the Latas estate in the parish of St. Patrick. And the other picture, we still don't know who that nice young older woman is who decided to hold Maurice's face. Okay, go ahead, next one. The other is, of course, Maurice with Fidel Castro and Jamaica's Michael Manley. Next one. This one is the first rally after the revolution in 1979 in what was then Queen's Park, which is now the Karani James National Stadium. The pioneer movement and the People's Revolutionary Army. The pioneers were for young people between the ages of 9 and 12, and it was basically getting them involved in volunteerism, and of course the People's Revolutionary Army on the other side. One of the hallmarks of the revolution was billboards. Of course, we didn't have cell phones back in those times, so you couldn't send around, messages. So you gave all these wonderful upbeat messages through billboards, and the slogan of the revolution was then "forward ever, backward never." And the last one, again, billboards. One, encouraging women to get into non-traditional jobs. And one of the, I think, the best legacies of the revolution is education as a right and not as a privilege. Okay, next slide. The successes of the revolution under the leadership of the People's Revolutionary Government must not be overlooked. These include the building of an international airport as a major boost to the economy, a maternity leave law for women, the first in the OECS, equitable wages for men and women in the agricultural sector, the formation of a national insurance scheme, again the first in the OECS, free secondary education, government scholarships for tertiary education, and the development of a literacy program especially targeted to the older members of the society, public dental clinics established in each parish, the General Hospital for the I'm given a 24-hour casualty service and 2 operating theatres, the establishment of low-cost housing in the parishes of St. Andrew and St. George, the establishment of the Maribou Farm School, Grenada Agro-Industries to produce local juices, nectars, jams, jellies, the Produce Chemist Lab to make local perfume, the establishment of a national fishery school and a fish processing plant in which fish was smoked, filleted, dried, salt fish was made, and tinned tuna and flying fish in tomato sauce was made and exported. The establishment of a national transportation service with a fleet of 26 buses that ran from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. with an all-female conducting crew. Next slide. Having stated its benefits and the lure it offered to Caribbean intellectuals like Brian Meeks and Richard Hart from Jamaica, Merle Hodge from Trinidad, and Didicus Jules from St. Lucia, it must be emphasized that the flaws of the revolutionary process led to its demise. Paternalism juxtaposed with this popular enthusiasm for the revolutionary process seems a contradiction. In its 1973 manifesto, the NJM stressed the need to establish people's assemblies as the only means by which the fundamental rights and freedoms of people could be enforced. As the manifesto expounded, quote, "We reject the party system. It divides the people into warring camps, and it fails to involve the people except for a few seconds once every 5 years when they make an X on the ballot paper," unquote. On ascending to power, the revolutionary government established parish councils and zonal councils as the hallmark of people's power. Yet, the participatory structures of these parish and zonal councils and the annual budget debate were themselves deeply flawed. A former member of the NJM, Bernard Board, noted, and I quote, "It was party members themselves who organized these zonal council meetings. At no time did we show the people that we had confidence in them to do these things themselves," unquote. This experiment of people's power failed, and Grenada's initial promise to have elections never materialized. This flaw led to the revolution being criticized by its Caribbean neighbors, including Dominica under Dame Eugenia Charles, as being undemocratic. Operating within a Caribbean context, more so one with a British legacy, a complete departure from democratic processes and procedures did not augur very well for good relations. And while the PRG bemoaned victimization, violence, and restrictions of freedom of the press under Gary's regime, they found themselves committing the same atrocities. The PRG detained at least 718 people in the period 79 to 83, without granting them any legal representation or taking their cases to court. Persons detained included former Gary supporters, former colleagues, and members of the Rastafarian community. Freedom of speech was curtailed as the Torchlight and Grenada Voice newspapers were shut down for printing what was defined as destabilizing literature. The editor of the Grenada Voice newspaper was imprisoned. Operating within the confines of this paternalistic model, the PRG attempted to shift the economic model from a capitalist structure to a mixed economy. In the adoption of this approach, the PRG combined private, public, and cooperative sectors. The International Monetary Fund's reviews were positive on the relationship with the private sector, and Grenada's economic growth was 3% between 79 and 83, which was on par with its OECS peers. More significantly, using this model, Grenadians benefited from a social wage, that is, medical and dental services, university scholarships, school books and uniforms, adult literacy, for which they did not have to pay. The model, however, had its flaws. There was little diversification in the agricultural sector. It remained tied to the three main crops of cocoa, nutmeg, and bananas. An attempted shift to non-traditional exporters in the socialist bloc nations proved inconsequential, as the export figure was only 9.3 by 1982. Declining international prices, along with internal issues of pests, disease, and inadequate supporting infrastructure, translated into a fall in exports from 18.4 million in 1979 to 10.5 million in 1983. The cooperative sector did not produce the profits envisioned, and the tourism sector did not fare well in an island-sprouting anti-imperialist language. There was a steady decline of stopover tourists between 1979 and 1983, from 323,000 to 22,700. Although the PRG received a large influx of foreign aid, its policymakers were unable to formulate and implement policies leading to a more effective utilization of the aid funds. Entrepreneurial talent and the supply of skilled labor was limited. Internal conflicts plagued the 1795 and the 1979 revolutionaries. In 1795, it weakened the revolutionary stance against the British. But in 1979, it led to a catastrophic implosion of October 19, 1983. For the People's Revolutionary Government, paternalism found itself so embedded in its outlook that in the 1983 period of crisis, the option to address the way forward for the revolution was to strengthen the Leninist vanguard, a model in which power came from the top, concentrated in a few hands. By October 1983, these few hands were on the verge of sheer exhaustion by the workload they were expected to complete. It included their substantive post in the private and public sector, attendance at rallies, party work, study group sessions, and voluntary work on weekends. This exceedingly demanding schedule resulted in 5 members of the Central Committee being ill or hospitalized 1 year prior to the collapse of the revolution. But despite this reality, they did not broaden the base of the leadership. Having spent about 25 years in jail, former member of the PRG, Joseph Lane, posits that there was no conspiracy theories or any ideological differences between Prime Minister Bishop and Deputy Prime Minister Court. Lane noted, and I quote, "There was a serious mismatch between resources required and resources available for the strategy we were pursuing. The mismatch manifested itself in a squabble for resources and manpower, resulting in internal conflicts which fractured many relationships, most notably the relationship between Bishop and Court." He further noted that while the Grenadian people saw Bishop as the undisputed leader, persons close to the center of the revolution were aware that in reality the revolution was led by a partnership. In the days leading up to October 19, 1983, the Grenadian people did not see their hero, Maurice Bishop, through the Central Committee's lens. The Central Committee failed to recognize how people relate to a charismatic hero figure within a Caribbean historical context. Brian Meeks, again, in recognizing that delicate balance of power between Bishop and Court, noted that Central Committee members themselves might have involuntarily tipped the balance to one side by leading chanting sessions at rallies for Maurice, Maurice, Maurice. The psychological dimension cannot be understated. Maurice's main and direct constituents became the masses, not the party. Thus, Bishop did not see joint leadership through the lens of most of his comrades on the Central Committee, but rather as a vote of no confidence in him as leader. Bishop's main concern was how the main constituents, the masses, the people, would view this matter of of joint leadership. Not yet, go back, sorry. The events of October 9th to 19th of 1983 seems like a boulder catapulting down a mountainside and spiraling out of control. Yet there were opportunities to staunch, to stall, to press pause, to rethink, and to re-evaluate. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Bishop agreed to and subsequently reneged on joint leadership. His Central Committee members saw his vacillation as part of his character they did not like. And whether Maurice Bishop did in fact spread a rumor as a last-ditch attempt to attain support from the Central Committee or the masses still remains very unclear. This, however, led to his house arrest. Even at that juncture, there was room for negotiations, and some efforts were made to engage neutral parties, like Michael Alls, the Trinidadian Labour leader, and Rupert Roopnarine, Working People's Alliance leader from Guyana. Yet both sides remained fixed in their stances, with the Bishop group seeking the assistance of the masses to force the hand of the opposing side. Bernard Cord, writing 40 years later, admitted that on October 18th, he finally recognized and understood the stance Bishop had taken. Yet, he did not walk next door. Note, they were neighbors, to Bishop to ask to bury the hatchet and save the revolution. Instead, as French Republican Gaspard Conrad's words 200 years prior rings through, quote, "The insanity of pride," unquote, took precedence and the opportunity was lost. With Bishop's release from house arrest by the masses, it seemed that there was yet another window of opportunity for compromise. The decision to proceed to Fort Rupert, now Fort George, rather than the Market Square, meant that the battle lines were drawn in the sand. The end result was murder and mayhem. Next slide. This was followed swiftly on its heels by a US-led intervention/invasion. The 1979 revolution occurred under the Carter administration in the US. And while US policies of Manifest Destiny and Monroe Doctrine remained in play, Carter's foreign policy focused on human rights and diplomacy rather than on destabilization and intervention. This permissive world context, coupled with Grenada's relative obscurity and secretive nature of the revolution's planning, allowed for its success. However, the character of this permissive worldview changed by 1981. The Reagan administration sought to highlight US policies of Manifest Destiny and Monroe Doctrine, which are penchant to roll back communism. Grenada's importance as a threat to US national security was elevated. The building of the international airport was viewed as a Soviet and Cuban base from which weapons could be moved to South America. According to President Reagan, quote, "It isn't nutmeg that's at stake in the Caribbean and Central America. It's US national security," unquote. The island's geographical position at the end of the southern Caribbean chain was of strategic importance to the safety of shipping lanes used by the United States. The revolution was also a dangerous model of an alternative approach to development. Maurice Bishop highlighted this point in his Hunter College speech in 1983, noting that Grenada's successful experiment would now appeal to millions of Black Americans in their quest for fairness and equality. US Professor Ron Daniels noted that this small island of 100,000 people had become, quote, "the source of a global movement, a centerpiece of global solidarity," unquote. U.S. apprehension was manifested in 1981 by the staging of trial military maneuvers referred to as Amber and the Amberdeens. The Reagan administration tried to isolate the PRG from its Caribbean colleagues by insisting that its contribution to the Caribbean Development Bank was contingent on excluding Grenada. When a US-led invasion came on October 25, 1983, it came with the blessing of members of the OECS, led by Dame Eugenia Charles. In her speech to the press, she noted the unprecedented assassination of Maurice Bishop and other members of the government in a usually peaceful Caribbean context could not go unaided. And while there was controversy among Caribbean leaders on this call for the US to intervene with Caribbean assistance, for many of us in Grenada, it was the end of a few days of great uncertainty and fear. Next slide. What are the lessons to be learned from these revolutionary processes? Being at the center of this maelstrom and speaking in hindsight, they always say hindsight is 20/20 vision. After over 25 years in prison, Bernard Cord and Joseph Lane have similar advice on the flaws of paternalism and the staunch adherence to the vanguard. Court noted the need for checks and balances in terms of the exercise of power and the need for an open, vibrant, multi-party democracy. Lane further elucidated that while a vanguard party was appropriate for taking power, a much broader form of party was needed post-1979. Quote, such a broad-based party operating along democratic rather than democratic centralist lines would have allowed the NJM to draw on the wisdom and experience of thousands of older and more mature Grenadians. It would have brought wisdom and realism to the work of the party and to our decision-making, unquote. Historian and political analyst David Hines, in his analysis of Guyana's WPA and Grenada's NJM as socialist parties operating within the region, concur that any fundamental transformation by necessity requires a broad national alliance, which is diametrically opposed to vanguardism. For socialism to operate within a Caribbean context, it must be tempered with some measure of democracy. The tenets of liberty and equality must be maintained. This would mean no special privileges based on education or social position, rationalism or differences in the operation of government or political ideas should be resolved by compromise and not by force. The 1979 revolution erred in all three areas. Freedom of the people were restricted by imprisonment without trial, and those who were educated with the science of Marxist-Leninism held on to the reins of power and were not inclusive of the people as they should have been. Lack of compromise on the matter of joint leadership proved a fatal error. In post-1983, the Grenadian political landscape has been marred with several instances of internal conflicts among political parties. The lessons of compromise, conflict resolution, and tolerance, which should have been learnt from the 1795 and the 1979 revolution, was not. Authoritarian rule reminiscent of Gary and the PRG manifested itself in Prime Minister Herbert Blaze's style. For example, a censorship board was established in 1987, empowered to pass judgment on calypsos played on the radio in public spaces. Passports were withdrawn from former NJM members, and persons returning from Cuba with medical degrees were barred from jobs. It continued. Internal wrangling plagued the National Democratic Congress, Soon after winning the elections in 1990, 2008, they really were not listening, and again in 2012. By 2012, internal wrangling within the party led Prime Minister Tillman Thomas to prorogue Parliament to avert a vote of no confidence against him. The party faced a power struggle for its leadership, and Thomas's position as Prime Minister was viewed as weak, and that of former NJM members like Nazim Burke and Peter David as more dynamic. It became evident that the NDC's leadership, some of whom were part of the 1979 revolutionary process, learned the lessons of negotiation and compromise. One of the very reasons for the implosion of the 1979 revolution led to the NDC's own demise in 2012. Next slide. Political alliances or coalitions formed in Grenada between 1984 and 2013 were merely accommodations among the elite political class. The alliances were not grounded in mass movement. It made them fragile, and it led to fragmentation and political volatility. What has developed is a deeply polarized Grenadian society. The vision of the electorate is focused on colors: yellow for the National Democratic Congress and green for the New National Party, and often to the detriment of the good of the state as a whole. And while Grenada has transitioned to formal democracy and constitutional rights and civil liberties are enjoyed, Grenadian political scientist Dr. Wendy Grenade argues that electoral democracy was attained at the expense of substantive democracy. There's a need for the creative mechanism for ordinary people to be more involved in their governance. Arguably, a return to the PRG's concept of grassroots democracy can be a solution. However, the flaws of the process as is operated under the PRG must be addressed. The valid contributions of ordinary people at parish councils, at zonal councils, must be heard and addressed without directives from the top. One of the political challenges that faces the region that the Grenada Revolution sought to grapple with and failed is how to transcend what Dr. Grenade defines as the politics of survivability. That is, a political process that is largely dependent on the importance of the political party and the powers of the Prime Minister. We also need to question whether there is a role for the charismatic maximum leader. Some argue that this elevated status can lead to delusions of grandeur if the person does not have the moral strength to resist it, and if institutional mechanisms have not been established to control it. Others see the charismatic leader as a vital resource in assisting the population to identify the goals of social and economic change, of mobilizing people for the enormous task of nation building and basic economic development. The lesson to be learned is that the charismatic leader needs to recognize that his or her purpose is finite. I might be getting myself in trouble. Anyway, the Caribbean now needs to move towards a political system that sustains rather than just survives. There is need for a political system that transcends political parties and ideologies, and when nation building and the holistic development takes precedence. There needs to be the creation of a space where the citizen moves from being a mere voter to an active participant in his or her nation's development. The 1979 revolution was led by primarily young people. And while historians have argued that the exuberance of youth contributed to the revolution's downfall, One of its valuable lessons is the creation of avenues for the youth, especially through education as a pathway to development. Thus, one of the lasting legacies of the revolution was its promotion of education, free secondary education, and tertiary education scholarships. This has continued in Grenada. Tertiary education scholarships to Cuba have continued, and now to China. And very recently, the extension of free tertiary education at the T.A. Marichaud Community College. This assures that the revolution's legacy is still alive. Next one. One of the unfortunate legacies of the Grenada Revolution within Grenada is what I call amnesia, or forgetting, burying the past so deep that it's difficult to speak about it, to reflect on it, to process it, and to come to terms with it. The collective memory of a generation has remained, for the most part, silent. To raise the issue can lead to sorrow or anger for a dream lost, tears of regret, smiles of pleasant memories, even today, fear of reprisals, shouting matches as to who should be blamed. The truth is, Grenadians never received any debriefing or counseling for the traumatic experiences of the implosion of the revolution, the hurt and pain for those who faced ridicule and imprisonment during the revolution, or closure for those who lost loved ones on Fort George or during the military invasion. Most physical relics of the revolution, next one, have been erased. Equipment, for example, from the agro-industries plant was sold. The NTS buses became PTS buses and were left to die a slow death of rust behind a government building. Revolutionary spaces were renamed, and Grenada's history was not taught. Last one. But all is not lost. While we still have a very long way to go, there are some positive strides, and notably under the leadership of the National Democratic Congress. Although himself a political detainee during the revolution, Prime Minister Tillman Thomas endorsed the renaming of the international airport in Maurice Bishop's honor in 2009. In June of 2023, the Ministry of Education endorsed the publication of the text Collins Junior History of Grenada for young readers that includes a chapter on the Grenada Revolution. For the very first time this year, Grenada marked October 19th as National Heroes Day. And at the budget speech last Wednesday, Prime Minister Deacon Mitchell announced the procurement of land for the establishment of a Heroes Park. The Grenadian political landscape has erupted in revolution on 3 occasions in just under 200 years. Across that time and space continuum, paternalism, internal conflict, polarization have directed the course and the collapse of these upheavals. Looking ahead, we must learn from the errors of our past experiences. Tolerance, compromise, and the earnest inclusion of people in the political processes are the key to the survival of any government. Government must consistently work for the holistic development of the state and not fall victim to partisan interests or to the strict, unwavering adherence to dogma. Only then can we ensure the development of our Caribbean nations for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philip Dow, for this presentation. It was excellent. Thank you very much. Another clap for Dr. Dow. And now we will have our open discussion. So UD is going to help me. And UD is last year's valedictorian of the Open Campus. Well, now we're the Global Campus. And UD is going to have the roving mic. And he will come around. I invite Dr. Dow, well, as soon as she's finished having some water, to come back to the podium. And as you have a question, you just raise your hand and UD will recognize you and bring the mic to you. And then Dr. Dow will be able to answer from the podium. So thank you very much, UD, for assisting with that.
And we have somebody who's going to open the batting.
Yeah. In true cricket balance. Good evening. Yeah, in true cricket balance. Thank you very much, Professor.
No, it's not professor yet, but thank you for calling it into existence. Amen.
Maya Angelou said, your teacher, your mentor, your professor. That's all right. But first of all, thank you for a wonderful and very insightful speech. Grenada means a lot to us. Some of us, we're very close to the revolution and to Grenada. Spiritually, personally, ideologically. I was impacted in many ways because a mentor, a teacher, a dear friend of mine was murdered on that fateful day at Fort George. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about Jacqueline Craft. Mm-hmm. I'm emotional every time I speak about that. But here's the thing, 40 years on, the region and Grenada, yes, is very much in a similar situation. Mm-hmm. Many of the yearnings of Morris and his comrades, we're still grappling with them. So here's the thing. The issues of inclusivity, which you spoke about, the issue of democracy, of a strong economy, of participation, accountability, all of these things still remain with us. The reality is, this region and Grenada, we have tremendous opportunities, but we also have great strength and talents. Mm-hmm. Opportunities of the 21st century, the third millennium, the third decade of this millennium, with a knowledge economy and these great opportunities that we have before us. Education, the blue, the green, the orange economy.
Orange economy, yes.
Whatever. But there are challenges. So access to health, quality health care, education. All of these things, and of course, the issue of the climate crisis. This is a big burden for small states. But a big problem still persists in the region is the lack of resources to be able to address the myriads of things that we are faced with. What is what Morris and Bernard and the others faced with. They couldn't address all of these issues with the scarce resources available to Grenada. Mm-hmm. And we see the same thing in Dominica and the other OECS islands. Most of the things we try to do, we estimate we cannot do it, we can't move. They don't give us enough breathing space. Whether it's be CBI, whether it be financial services, commodities, except if it's oil and gas. So the options we have are very, very limited. And I don't want to go on and on and on, but the question is, as a region, and not just Grenada or Dominica, what are the options we have really, truly available to us to address all of these challenges, all of the issues, but taking, of course, into consideration the tremendous opportunities that we have with us in the global economy, in the global space, and of course in the region and in our individual island states. Thank you.
Thank you. Loaded question. And I'm not a politician. The resources that we have are limited, and that is true. I think sometimes we, and I think Grenada made errors there. When I spoke about the economic system that operated during the period of the PRG, when you speak to persons who were part of the process, they will tell you that they didn't have enough and they had not done enough and they felt they weren't doing enough. And when you look back in hindsight, you realize that in the very short time period that they had, and the limited resources that they had, they did quite a lot. And I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. We have to recognize that we're coming from a position where we don't have, but it's trying to make do with the little bit that we do have. And one of our challenges is that we talk about the orange economy as an example. We talk about the blue economy as an example. It's to shift the mindset away from things that we looked at traditionally as being the answer to our issues, and start looking more at different ways of doing things. So for example, we throw agriculture out the window because nobody wants to pick up a cutlass and a fork and go out there and do agriculture anymore. But we have not taken the step of seeing agriculture in a different way, where we link agriculture with tourism, so that when a tourist comes to the Caribbean, they can get stuff made in the Caribbean rather than importing the stuff from outside, and finding the new ways of, for example, doing agriculture, so that we link one to the next. So changing mindset is not an easy thing. It never is easy to change mindsets, but we have to start thinking, we have to think outside the box, and we have to empower our young people. I mean, there is no other way. We have to empower them. We can't just sit back and say, oh, they're young, they don't know what they're doing, they don't know what they're talking about. But we have to find ways to empower them, and education is the key to doing that, so that they recognize when we are relaxing on our rocking chairs, they are the ones who are going to be at the forefront. And they are the ones that are going to be pushing things like the orange economy and the blue economy. So we need to educate them on those things now, so that they could take up the challenge later on. I hope I answered your question as best as I could.
Good evening. Let me just support Sobers in thanking Yui and presenter for the way you put everything together. I mean, we have read a lot about the Grenada Revolution, all aspects, but you put all of them together in a nice sequence, connecting all the dots, and I really want to thank you for that. I supported the Grenada Revolution up to this present time. I think it was necessary because of the ideals at the time. I mean, you mentioned the flaws and the issues why it never succeeded. But my view is the demise of the revolution basically was the revolution gave the US government an excuse they wanted. If it didn't happen in the year it happened, it would have happened. If it didn't happen in October, it would have happened in November or December or 2024, because the Americans would have never allowed such an example to flourish. We have seen the examples in Haiti, what happened to Aristide. So we have evidence of interference over the Caribbean and Latin America. So my view is it happened at that time. The Caribbean, the 6 Caribbean countries who facilitated. I'm asking whether in your research has any of them ever expressed some regret on reflection as to their role, whether their role was genuine or whether it was coerced by whatever form behind the scenes. But my view is, as you mentioned, I want to support the view that the modern day Grenada, its development is linked to the revolution and some of the positives of it. I mean, I've been to Grenada, so we went there probably 1980, the year after. Went by boat, an excursion. We had a good time. well secured, move about the place. I remember we stayed at Boca Village. That name will never leave us. And what I admire about the Grenada Revolution, the Grenadians up to this time, is the degree of patriotism up to this present time. So I see tenets of the revolution being manifested right now. But my question is whether, in your research, any of the 6 express any expression of regret on reflection of the role. Thank you.
Okay. from all that has been written thus far, and there's been quite a lot written on the Grenada Revolution, by the first set of stuff was written by Americans who didn't have a clue what they were talking about. I didn't say that. And then Caribbean intellectuals and now Grenadians writing, and those who actually took part in the process. And thus far, there hasn't been any regret in what happened in October 83 in terms of US invasion and Caribbean forces joining. And there was a lot of controversy when it happened. OECS upset with CARICOM, CARICOM upset with OECS. Should they have asked for US invasion? Should they have asked for the US to take part? Should they have let Grenada sort it out on their own? What legality did the United States have in coming into Grenada? We were still under the British Commonwealth. Should it have come from Britain instead, for example? You asked about coerce. There's a big question mark on the role of the Governor General at the time. It said that he would have signed to say, yes, come. But we're fully aware that that signature took place after the US invaded. The signature took place afterwards. But there isn't any signs of saying that should not have happened or that's not the way it should have gone. And yes, you're right. The US was not happy with Grenada. And understandably so, based on the politics of the time. We were outside of the box. We were going in the opposite direction to what the United States stood for. When Grenada had made its ties with Cuba, and the US expressed their dissatisfaction, Morris's response was, we are not in anybody's backyard and we're not for sale, unquote. So it's like, leave us alone. And once those sorts of exchanges starts taking place, the US would have seen Grenada as a threat. And they were very clear in saying that it was a threat. I think if the revolution itself did not have its internal conflicts, and it didn't break apart internally, if it was that the US had invaded when everything was okay, it would have been more murder and more mayhem in Grenada, because once Morris dies, you did have some Grenadians who went out and fought, yeah? But the reality is, once you had the Prime Minister in charge and everything was going okay, if there was an invasion, a lot more persons would have died, because they would have come out in their numbers to defend their revolution. And yes, there are a lot of positives of the revolution that we have been building on now. Education is one of them. One of the things that the revolution did, free secondary education. Prior to that, you had to pay to go to secondary school before 1980. And for a number of families, if they had any money, they sent the boys to school as opposed to the girls. So what the revolution did was to push more girls into secondary education. And what we find happening now is that we're seeing a lot of these women now in positions of power, middle management, especially private sector and public sector. And most of them got that boost during that period. So we're seeing some of the effects of it even today. The national insurance scheme that came about during the revolution is one of our hallmarks now. And the scheme has extended. At once it was giving just maternity leave, now there's paternity leave. So it has built up over time. So there are some real positives of the revolutionary process. And I can't even start talking about the international airport in terms of how it has revolutionized our tourism industry in Grenada, as opposed to the smaller airport that we would have had during the period of the revolution. So yes, thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dow. Good night. I applaud your sincerity and thanks for the insight and the education. Now, scholars in the region say up to this day that the Grenada Revolution was a revolution of the people. Yet, Maurice Bishop got his demise, he was assassinated. What, in your mind, what do you think really caused that sort of thing? Because to me, Brother Bishop was a visionary, a man with a lot of determination to see Grenada succeed. In fact, I see now from next year, early next year, Grenada going to get a big increase. Maybe that's a good change. I think he had those things in mind. But what do you think really caused that sort of, assassination, demise? Seeing that even though scholars say it was a revolution by the people. Thank you.
We are kind of a little bit of a contradiction because on one hand, it was a popular revolution. Popular from the standpoint from day one, people came out and supported the revolution in terms of, on the morning of the 13th of March, 1979, people left their homes, went to police stations, and insisted that they put the white flag up because it's time for a takeover. So you got that inclusion of the people. During that period, you saw what could be defined only as a Grenadian pride in themselves. Basic and simple things like volunteering on a weekend to take care of your community. Yep. Young people going out to teach older people how to read and write. So from that point of view, it was very popular. But then you have the other side where you had persons who left Grenada because they did not want to deal with a socialist revolution at all. Yes, they wanted change from Gary and what he was doing, but they were not comfortable with a shift in ideology. And you find some people who started off supporting because they wanted that change and giving their full support to the revolution. But once they recognized that there's a shift in ideology, they started withdrawing because they felt uncomfortable with this new system. I would use the Rastafarian community as an example. They were on board with the revolution, the majority of them. However, the revolution failed them because they expected, for example, that if this revolution is talking about freedom, that they should be able to, well, they could be able to smoke a spliff. I mean, nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's all part of the process. That did not happen. But that in itself is one thing, but they were victimized. They were put into special camps. They had their locks cut off. And what is interesting is it's only today when we were having the conversation about the Dread Act in Dominica, I remembered that in doing research on Bishop, you found him being with the Rastas of Dominica and saying you should not treat them in this way, they should not be treated in that manner. And yet, when you get into power, you do the exact same thing that you said you were not going to do. So there's a lot of contradictions. You have the support on the one hand, but then you start doing things that you were against in the first instance. So that was an issue. The assassination of Bishop will always have question marks. And it will have question marks because even up to now, there are persons who have not spoken about what happened. And maybe we will not know now. Recent history is very difficult history to talk about and to write because people are still alive. So there are persons who genuinely believe that there were ideological differences between Maurice and Bernard. And there are others who think that the differences was not so much ideological as it was personal differences between the two. And they were very different people. Morris was the old drop-dead gorgeous handsome lord. Anyway, very handsome gentleman. Yes, even at that point I thought he was handsome when I was small. He was very charismatic, you know, got to the people. He would stand there and speak, and people would sit for hours and listen attentively because he had that ability. Bernard Cord, on the other hand, was the strategist and the tactician who worked behind the scenes, but excellent in terms of how he operated the economy. So there were two different sides of a coin. I think one of the failings was the idea of joint leadership was a no-no. And when you think in hindsight about it, how did they ever think that that was going to work in a Grenadian context? It was not going to work. When you looked at how the process unfolded for Grenada, the revolution was Morris and Morris was the revolution. So how do you say to the regular people that, okay, so we're not having one prime minister anymore, we're having two? Okay, that makes no sense. Yep, that is not what they are accustomed to. That's not what they know. So insisting that that was the way to go was a horrible, horrible idea. And there are those who are convinced that the pushing for that to happen came specifically from Cord, and it became an issue of a power struggle. Yep. There are others who believe that he basically thought that that was the way forward and he was not about to change in his stance. But as I mentioned, he's written about 3 books on the process. And I remember when I read the last one, when he said on October 18th, he understood how Morris felt, that it was a vote of no confidence against him. The question remains, why didn't he go next door and say, listen, this does not make sense? Yep. So that will always remain a question. Is it that the insanity of pride, I'm not going to do this because I'm sticking to my stance, and then at the end of the day, the result of it is assassination? And even then, it still makes you think, well, okay, so Morris is taken from house arrest, and you get to a point where he can go to the market square, or he could go to the fort. He goes to the fort. Oh boy, trouble. That's a military establishment. Civilians are not supposed to be in a military establishment. That's rule number 1. Yes, he is leader of the armed forces, but he could go. Hundreds of people shouldn't go. And then there's controversy once you get there. The soldiers who are there complain that they were disarmed by the people who came onto the fort. Okay, so you've armed yourself. So what does that mean once that arming takes place, right? So at what point do you say stop? Yep. And it seemed as though there was no rational thought once you got to that on the fort situation. And even then, when the armored cars are sent, and there was a gentleman at the front of one of the pictures of the army, that is actually Joseph Lane. And he says he takes responsibility for sending those 3 armored cars up to the fort. There's still another question mark. So you've sent 3 armored cars up to the fort for order. Yes, for order. So the first level of the fort, there's an exchange of fire. One side says the fort fired first, the next side says the armored cars fired first. Whoever fired, you have people jumping 40, 50 feet for their life. Is either you face these armored cars or you jump. All right? There was a young girl, she was a teenager, who was in the operations room where Morris was, when the firing started, a bullet went straight through her head. And the sad part is her mother was there with her. And she was part of the process of getting people to go to Morris and, get him out of house arrest. So how do parents deal with these situations? 16-year-old boy went and he never came home. He just has not been seen ever again. So these are the realities. But even at that point, there's an exchange of fire. Okay, we're not sure who fired first. All right. Then how do you explain pulling Morris out, Jacqueline out, Unison Whiteman out, Norris Bain out, and marching them up about 30 flights of stairs to the parade square and assassination? So there were points where someone needed to say, stop it. And it seemed as if the world had gone crazy. And that is the difficulty that people have to try and grapple with. Yeah? How do you grapple with that sort of thing? And it's really very painful. Extremely painful.
Let me say good evening again. First of all, I want to applaud you for excellent chronicling of the information you have shared with us. And there's a lot of thought processing that has to go through that, actually. But one question I want to ask. On your slide, I noticed you had Ronald Reagan and Dame Eugenia Charles alongside.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't get much information as to, or maybe I should ask you the question, what was Dame Eugenia Charles' role within that time?
Okay. Dame Eugenia, like I think it would have been Barbados under Tom Adams, Jamaica under Edward Seaga, were not happy with the idea of a socialist revolution in Grenada. When Dame Eugenia spoke about the revolution, one of the things that she says just before this, in the interview actually, when she meets with, she's presenting herself to the press, she mentions that she was convinced that Maurice was leading in the direction of some level of democracy and the possibility of an election. However, the other side did not think that that necessarily was the way to go. And I think the fallout takes place between Grenada and its Caribbean neighbors once you said, yes, we're going to have elections. So it's military coup. So we start off unorthodox. But having taken power, there's the pronouncement that there will be free and fair elections. And that never happened. So what happens is Grenada being ostracized by some islands in the region. And Dominica was one of those islands under Eugenia Charles. She was not really happy with this idea of this undemocratic form of government. And so when the situation happened in Grenada, she does take the lead, in asking for assistance in returning law and order to Grenada. She comes under fire, by the way. She comes under fire from other countries in the region. Trinidad's attitude was, you didn't discuss this with us. Guyana's attitude was the same. This was not discussed with us. You cannot make these decisions without involving everybody in the process, all right? Now, as to why she would not have included everyone still remains a question mark. Maybe it was the fear that, I don't know if it's a Caribbean thing, we just talk too much. Somebody may have said something, but it really was planned in secret. Only a few persons knew of this arrangement with the United States and getting Caribbean neighbors to help in the process. So I featured her because when the announcement is made, it's herself and President Reagan that makes the actual announcement that this is what is going to happen. And she did express her genuine concern over what was happening in Grenada the Prime Minister is dead, and not just he died, the Prime Minister is assassinated, how do you move forward in a case like this? Do you leave Grenada to figure it out on its own, or do you provide assistance?
You have another
I
question?
realize I'm hearing from the gentlemen. What happened to the ladies? Oh, wonderful.
I'd like to say thank you to the University of the West Indies for providing us with this lecture. Let me just state, I am a product of the Grenadian Revolution.
All right.
It had its pros and its cons. I was a young girl when March 13th came about. And, but I was conscious enough to know that what could have brought on that revolution. Because we had this case where Eric Gary came in as the union leader and fighting for the rights of estate workers who were being underpaid and so. But the estate workers, they were uneducated, and so they formed a large majority of the population. And so Gary had them on a string. So he led them again. God bless Uncle Gary, you know.
No, you have to sing the song right.
Oh.
We will never let a leader fall. Right, okay.
Right. So this was the kind of thing that we had to deal with. And, you know, you also had the violence. It was not nice as a child in Grenville town watching innocent Belma beating Morris Bishop, drag them from the Deluxe Cinema and bring it. So there came, that was a Sunday. This had to stop. There was a lot of political violence, police brutality, and we had the freedom of the press. You talk too much, well, you know, Mongoose gang coming for you. So those things brought on that kind of a thing. Plus, it was alleged that Gary had left instructions that Morris Bishop and the members of the NGM should be liquidated. So therefore, the morning of March 13th, you heard, attention, attention, attention. The government of the criminal dictator Eric M. Gary has been overthrown. And the rest is history.
Yes.
The revolution did a lot because, I mean, say there was a lot of consciousness, patriotism, and awareness. And I mean, say, although you were never too young, because you had the pioneers with the flowers of the revolution, and you had, you know, the youth, and so on. And there was that kind of ownership, in a sense, that, you know, people, you felt that Grenada was yours, you know. Education was no longer a privilege, it was a right. And as a result of that, you could go to secondary school. I benefited from not having to pay school fees because there was Mr. So-and-so child who could have gone to some schools. And, you know, as you went along, you saw the use of the agro-processing of our mangoes and the nutmeg jams and jellies and so on. And this was very good. What happened after that with it? Well, I remember visiting places like in Grand Mall where they were doing the fish processing and so,
yeah.
okay? And to be honest, there was that sense of grow what you eat and eat what you grow. And I still maintain this, okay? Now, when we had all the rumblings of, you know, it was sad. And you talked about, I went to St. Joseph's Convent in Grenville. And we started the thing on the 18th, led by Gemma Belma, the one who was shot in her head.
Yes.
And it was a very sad day. I was afraid for my life. Because I know I was jumping, we stopped the plane from landing on Webb and tell them to carry off the news and so on in Pearls Airport, the small airport. But there was that level of fear still, because
you're down on the airfield jumping and, you know, saying free Grenada, free whatever. But on top there, the army camp was up there. And so it brought on, you know. Now, I want to just go on to the October 19th. My schoolmate got killed. The same Gemma Bellman, many others, you know. And they arrested many of our teachers. You see that time teachers had guts? Teachers had backbones? Yeah, they arrested some of the teachers from St. Joseph's Convent in Grenville. And we were afraid that, yes, they won't come back. I was afraid that they took my brother as well, that he was dead. I thought so. When we were told that Morris was killed, they killed the man that we loved. I didn't like this detention without trial, and I didn't like that at all. I couldn't. And another thing, Sunday morning come in and tell me go and do community service and have to go to church. That didn't go on. That wasn't going on. But when they killed Morris, that was it. The revolution was dead. DEAD. So anything could have happened. So they welcomed. We who were under house arrest, put it that way, at curfew, Sunday morning we could not go to church. We welcomed the U.S. invasion, intervention, call it what you will. Because it was no fun have a dusk to dawn curfew. And you in your home, you can't go outside. Even you go outside, but there were gunshots being heard lower down in the village. Who wants that?
Yeah.
So therefore, when you look at it, I'm wondering, did you really learn from Grenada? Dominica, did you learn from Grenada? Charisma is nice, you know, but at the same time, you can't put that in the pot, you know. So I am really glad that, you know, you came by. I wonder if we learn and how much the Caribbean has learned from this situation in Grenada. Can we draw the parallels in some of our between Grenada and some of our countries? So I think we still have a lot of work to do, and to bring closure. We still have not got the bodies of our people to bury them, and this we need to bring closure. So I thank you very much, and come again. I would like
thank
to
you so very much for that. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Professor?
Oh boy, they keep calling me professor. I'm taking it, thanks.
I want to ride on the comments just made by our Grenadian friend here. Just a quick question. You spoke about the leadership styles in the Caribbean. Do you see, or do we have the ingredients that might lead to another revolution in the Caribbean? Yes? Yes or no?
Oh boy.
Dr. Dow, there's somebody saying they have a question in the same vein. So, do you want to get a question?
From the lady, yes, please. We haven't heard from many of the ladies. So, okay, last one.
Just following on from that, and you talked a lot about analytic governing, and I just wondered, just quickly, I know you don't mean it's a male governance, it's a style. So
it's a style.
I just wondered what maternalistic might look like, just on the same.
Okay, all right, let me see if I can answer. The idea of the paternalistic form of government is one where it speaks to a few holding the reins of power and doing what they think is best for the rest, with not the inclusion that you would expect does not happen. And even though the Grenada Revolution said it was given an alternative to development, that way of governing still remained, because the few at the top still held on to that power. And even though you had things like parish councils and zonal councils and so on, you still were not giving the people the opportunity to, yes, they were able to say, but within specific parameters. And it showed itself very much on the issue of joint leadership, because the issue of joint leadership came from, again, the selected few. Yes, Morris disagreed, but it came from the selected few. And when he says, how would the masses look at it? He was shut down. So how do you speak about a change of government that is inclusive and gets the views of the people, and then at the same time, you don't want to hear their views when it comes to something that you insist that you want to do? So that's where the contradiction, happens. Ingredients for revolutions, I think, would always exist. It doesn't matter which part of the world. What I would say is, having experienced Grenada, and from the lady at the back, having experienced Grenada, the taking of power by force, it doesn't work out at the end of the day. And one of the things that we have to learn is how to compromise. Because if we don't, we end up repeating history over and over again and keep doing the same things over and over again. And yes, we have instances in the Caribbean where you feel like there is need for some sort of upheaval. It cannot be violent, because the violence doesn't pan out at the end of the day. At the end of the day, you end up in more problems with that sort of force than you do if you try an alternative. Now, I'm not saying that people should sit back and enjoy the ride. There are ways you can strike. There are other ways to express your dissatisfaction. But taking up guns, from our experience in Grenada, it's not the best option.
So good night, everyone. Great presentation, Dr. Dow, but I have two questions for you. I saw you spoke about Cuba's support to the revolution, and I am wondering, how can we explain Cuba's and the Soviet Union's support for the Grenadian Revolution, socialist policies with Cuba's communist ideology? And secondly, I am wondering, given the close proximity and shared culture of St. Vincent with Grenada, how did St. Vincent and the Grenadines support, or how did they react or respond to the revolution? I know that you said that a lot of countries took a step back when they found out about the elections, and no elections were part of the whole revolution. So how did they respond, to the Grenadian Revolution?
Okay, get the two questions. Cuba, right. Once Grenada decided that it was going along the socialist path to development, one of the first things that they would have done was to have relations with Cuba. That was the first one, and then to other socialist countries, or communist countries at the time. The connection to Cuba remained very strong. The building of the international airport was with the use of Cuban workers. We had a lot of teachers, for example, doctors, nurses, who came into Grenada and worked during that period of the revolution. What's interesting is, long after the revolution has fallen apart, Fidel Castro comes to Grenada and was welcomed by the Grenadian people, simply because of that connection between Grenada and Cuba. There are a lot of persons who were educated through that tertiary education exchange with Cuba. And one of the things that has remained is that connection still to Cuba, of persons going off to study. With regard to St. Vincent, yes, I mentioned Dominica, I mentioned Barbados. Trinidad a little bit was a little lukewarm. St. Vincent again was a little bit lukewarm. You're not sure as to how do you deal with this difference in the region. So what you found happening not only in St. Vincent but throughout the region, the socialist parties in each Caribbean island, you have them giving support. So whether it was the Socialist Party in Antigua, whether you have them giving support. What's interesting is as the revolution changed, so once you said election yes but no election, you have persons starting to say, does this really make sense? You start questioning, is this way the best possible way to go? And when you start having instances of detention without trial, some of the socialist parties in the region started asking questions again. How do you say this is an alternative to development and we're following this model, yet you're doing things that goes outside of the box? So you have instances of persons giving support and then with time sort of retracting because as the circumstances change, starting feeling really very uncomfortable with what was happening in Grenada. So you have love on one side, reservation on the other side, and it happens across the region. I hope I answered your question, darling.
Okay, Doc, we have there are a few persons who have indicated their interest for a question, and I'm not sure how much more time we have. But I think we have one question that is coming from the media. Some people who are following on the live, and they sent in a question. So Darren is going to give that question.
Good evening, and thank you for your lecture. Somebody who's following online wants to ask, after the invasion was approved by our very own Dame Eugenia Charles and the others, who was held accountable, if at all, for the killings committed by the U.S. against locals and civilians who may not have been part of the invasion? And there was another question, but because they fired on civilians, maybe not knowing that they would, not militia, and if there was any, let's say, commission of inquiry or anything that happened after that took place. Okay.
It was seen as war, and casualties of war. So one of the slides that I had put up shows a huge monument to the U.S. soldiers. Come on, let's see if you could find that one. There's a huge monument to U.S. soldiers. It shows a huge monument to United States soldiers, and with time we have the Cuban government has put up one for Cuba as well. For Grenada, that has not happened. There was recently a couple of guys who came together and decided to put up a little plaque in the cemetery to those officers that they knew who died during the actual invasion. But it's really very small, and it's at a part of the cemetery you see in trouble to get to it. So it's not like in a very public, accessible space, and that's one of the issues that still remains. That sort of closure. But it was just seen as war and basically casualties of war. Yeah.
Okay. On the interest of time, we will take in 3 more questions, and the first of this 3 is from Mr. McMurray, and then Mr. Dyer, and then Mr. Robin.
Okay, well, good evening. I think I've heard mention made here a lot of times about the fact that Eugenia Charles went to Washington supposedly to convince the Americans that they ought to intervene in Grenada. Unfortunately, I don't think she convinced them to come to Grenada. The Americans had already decided that they were going to come to Grenada. I think it's Dr. Dublin who said if they didn't come in October, they'd have come in November. If you remember, the excuse that he supposedly gave the American public had to do with the university, that the university students were in grave danger and they were likely to be killed if the Marines didn't go to rescue them. And secondly, he also said the airport that the Cubans had been building was not for tourism purposes, nor was it to carry arms to South America. The Cubans at the time were in Angola, defeating the South African army. So he said that airport is for the Cubans to carry more armaments to
to Angola,
which is next to South Africa, to fight against the South Africans. So Cuba, in point of fact, was very much involved in everything that was going on in Grenada at the time for the revolution. And the Americans didn't want to go to war themselves. So therefore they were doing everything in Africa to prevent the socialist government in Angola, to start with, from taking power and keeping power. And they instigated the South Africans to invade twice, 1975 and again in 1980s. And they were beaten both times by the Cubans. Yeah? Who sent a formidable force the second time, including airplanes and all of that, to Angola to fight against the South Africans. So we shouldn't be saying or believing that we convinced the Americans that they should come to Grenada, and that's why they came. Eugenia Child's presence there was just a very thin fig leaf, I would say. And in fact, in the United States itself, the people who were doing and planning, executing the invasion, did not put that up as the reason why they were coming. They never said that. They said they were going there to rescue the students who were in mortal danger, and secondarily to put Castro and his expansionist military plans on the country. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think sometimes we forget that the revolution had all these other geopolitical issues happening at the time because of the time in which it's happening, when there's this conflict between capitalism on one hand and socialism on the other, and we get drawn into the whole issue. So, because President Reagan was very clear why he came, and if you look at his script that he used to say why he came into Grenada, it's very similar to the script that he used to say why he came into other parts of the Caribbean, of course, to save American lives and property. I mean, that comes first. So you find the script being very, very similar wherever the US invaded. And as I said before, they were not comfortable with a socialist revolution in Grenada. And the links to Cuba was really an issue for them. So they were not going to happily sit by and, willingly accept. That was not going to happen. Last question? One before the last. All right.
Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening.
First of all, let me tell you that I'm a product of UWI.
All right.
And I'm very proud of your very informative lecture tonight.
Thank you.
My question is, after the revolution, your ex-prime minister, who is a product of the UWI, he visited Dame Eugenia Charles very often in Dominica. At times I attended that meeting. I want to ask you if that in any way significantly brought him into office.
And which prime minister are we talking about?
Huh?
Which prime minister are we talking about?
I'm from Dominica.
Which Grenadian prime minister?
I'm talking about Dr. Keith Mitchell.
Oh, no, I think he did all of his on his own. And
he was very often in Dominica, very close to Dame Eugenia Charles.
All right.
Before he came into office. And my second question is, in your research, did you ever find out Dame Eugenia Charles's position as far as Venezuela and the Bird Island for Dominica is? What?
No, that one I have not looked at, to be very honest. That one I have not looked at, to be very, very honest.
And our final question is from Mr. Robin.
Yes, and to pass to my question. You have had the advantage of revolutions. And it is said that according to a survey done by the Caribbean Food and Nutrition Council, that if we do not get tropical shipping or King Ocean don't come within 3 months, the Caribbean will starve. Now, given the fact that so many Grenadians have been educated worldwide, so to speak, and I don't think the problem is education. My question is on the fact that you have had the advantage of, the Maurice Bishop experience. Grenada is one of the largest producers of nutmeg in the world. I know that for a fact. I'm wondering, are you satisfied that the whole issue of food security and maybe economic revitalization that was being sought by Maurice Bishop has been, the idea has penetrated through the Grenadian psychic to the extent that they have taken up those ideas and have then translated some of those ideas into real projects that are making significant inroad in Grenada and in the global economy? If not, why? My second question is, we have heard a lot about the Grenada Revolution, but have you had any scientific analysis as to the number of Grenadians who died, the number of Cubans, the number of Americans, and totally how many people who died during the Grenada Revolution? Could you give us some
figures?
Insight into that?
Okay, let me remember the first question. Right. One of the flaws of when a revolution ends the way it does, and in our case, we had a lot of erasing of the memories of the revolution. Yeah? The agro-industries plant, for example, which would have been used for the manufacture of jams and jellies and juices and all of that, the equipment was sold. Yep. So it's just like shut down, that anything that had a linkage to the revolution was basically ended and shut down. Unfortunately, that affects us now. Yep. Because we still, what the revolution tried to do was to link, of course, the agriculture to the manufacturing. And once that was shut down and died, Grenada has to start over. And we have not done a very good job of the starting over. So that I still complain that in mango season we have hundreds of mangoes on the ground rotting, which did not happen during the period of the revolution. And we have not come to the point where we recognize there's a need for us to take up the mangoes and make mango juice, as opposed to having our children drinking Buster and sweet drink and whatever else is we drinking. You understand? So some of those values have not stayed with us, and I think it's because we shut them down. And yes, we are the largest producers of nutmeg, but we still have not taken the leap in terms of the manufacturing part of nutmeg. Yes, we have nutmeg, but that was somebody's private business. It has not gotten into the public sector so that it becomes a major driving force of the economy. And when this gentleman passed on a couple of years ago, you start asking questions, well, who is following in his footsteps? So these are some of the things that we have not, those are some of the lessons we didn't learn. And some of the things that fell by the wayside once the process ended. In terms of numbers, I think the US statue and the Cuban statue has the numbers on them. I don't remember them off the top of my head. I remember, I think when the US made their figure, it was somewhere, I think in the late teens, early 20s. And I remember someone responding that that's always not necessarily the case. The numbers would be more than, they actually see. The Cuban ones, it's listed, so you can actually see the names of all of the persons who died, and that number should be late 20s as well. For Grenada, the numbers on the fort is 21 on the day of the fort. The numbers for U.S. invasion still has question marks. As I said, a couple of the soldiers tried to put something up recently as a means of remembering fallen comrades. But you also have members of the armed forces who are saying the other people that they were with who disappeared, they've never seen them again, and there's nothing written to say that this person never came back home. So that one is still open-ended. We still have question marks for that one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very, very much, Dr. Philip Dow, for your response, and thank you to all of you who asked those wonderful questions. Thank you to Mrs. John Baptist for your own experience. Today, Nicole was telling me, how emotional it still is for so many people. I got the opportunity to go to Grenada to attend a conference on a similar topic, and it was very emotional for them as well. Same for you, Sobers. They really do feel the revolution still and the effects of what has happened. And Nicole always says it's because there has really been no closure for it. For a lot of us living here and sitting in this room, Maria has been like that for us. We didn't get even a chance to even grieve or think. We had to keep going and keep going and keep going. And so when a breeze blows, we feel the trauma. So we know what you are experiencing in terms of that, and no closure for trauma. So I thank all of you who had the questions for her, and I thank her for her patience in answering and in discussing. I will now invite Miss Nadia Rivera, who is the chair of our Alumni Association, and her degrees are from Global Campus 2011 and 2017. She will give the vote of thanks on behalf of her executive, who are really the ones who aided our site in planning the event for this evening. Miss Rivera.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Dr. Francis Severe, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of the UWI Global Campus. Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, Deputy Director, Global Campus Sites. Dr. Kimon Joseph, Head of the UWI Global Campus Dominica and staff of the UWI Global Campus Dominica. Mrs. Sandra Griffith Carrington, Alumni Officer of the UWI Global Campus. Father Nigel Karam, Dean, Our Lady of Fairhaven Cathedral. Mr. Delwyn James, Events and Retail Manager, Fort Young Hotel and Dive Resort, and staff of the Fort Young Hotel. Members of the executive of the UWI Alumni Association, Dominica Chapter. Members of the executive of the UWI Global Campus Guild of Students, alumni, friends of the UWI Global Campus, both here at Fort Young Hotel and those listening live via DBS Radio and Kyrie FM, media representatives. Good evening. On behalf of the UWI Global Campus Dominica and Fort Young Hotel and Dive Resort, we thank Dr. Nicole Philip Dow for first accepting our invitation to present the 13th annual Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture. Your presentation of the aims, successes, and failures of the Grenada Revolution and your ability to put the principles of the revolutionary period into contemporary context was done in a clear and concise manner. Your passion for Caribbean history certainly came through this evening's presentation. We are also grateful, very grateful as a matter of fact, to the others who participated in the program for this evening. Dr. Kimon Joseph, who served as our chair and gave our welcome remarks. We say thank you. We also thank Mr. Daryl Bob, I see he left already, for his rendition of the national anthem, and Father Nigel Karam for praying for our proceedings. We wish to express our thanks to Mr. Delwyn James for his collaborators' remarks on behalf of the Fort Young Hotel. And Delwyn, I wish to add my own expression of joy to you for having us here this evening to be back at the Fort Young Hotel. And it feels good to be back, I must say. I also wish to thank Ms. Karaya John Baptist, who introduced Dr. Philip Dow this evening. I am also grateful for the team of hardworking staff of the UWI Global Campus, as well as Fort Young Hotel, who worked behind the scenes to make this event a success. Thank you to those who prepared the programs, those who prepared the room, and those who served as ushers and assistants. We appreciate you. Our thanks also must be conveyed to the staff of the media institutions who have disseminated information about the lecture and who will use certain aspects of this evening's proceedings as news items over the next few days. We offer special thanks to DBS Radio and also Carry FM for carrying our event live. Steve, Cecil, the UWI thanks you all for that continued friendship and your continued support. Lastly, but certainly not least, we want to thank you, the audience members, both here in the audience and those of you who have joined us live from around the world for your participation in the lecture this evening. We wish everyone a safe journey home, and we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture series, which is the National Distinguished Lecture of the UWI Global Campus and the National Bank of Dominica in May of 2024, God's willing. We just want to thank you all again, and season greetings and good night.
Thank you very much, Nadia. And as I always say, it's the job of the chair to thank the person who gave the vote of thanks. So thank you. All right. Dr. Dow is available for some small conversations. We also want to take some photographs. We want to thank the participants or the contestants of the Miss Dominica pageant for being with us this evening. We would like a photo or two of you before you leave. We know that some of you have to travel very far, and so your bus is waiting, but we invite you all, in this cozy little place to just mingle around. We have a photographer, and so we thank everyone for being with us this evening, and God bless all of you. And we have our recognition of graduate ceremony on Friday, so we will disseminate the link for that by tomorrow, so that if you're not able to be with us physically, a lot of you, but at least you'll be able to join us for that online. So again, thank you very much for being here, and let's have a little bit of mingle before you go home. Thank you, everyone.
And there you have it. We have now come to the end of this evening's session of the 13th annual Dame Eugenia Charles Memorial Lecture at the University of the West Indies Global Campus, Dominica, and the Fortune Hotel and Dive Resort presented that. Of course, the theme is Freedom We Making, Lessons from the Grenada Revolution 1979 to 1983. You heard an excellent presentation from Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, who is the Deputy Director of the Global Campus sites. We heard the national anthem by Mr. Darrell Bob, invocation by Father Nigel Karam, welcome remarks from Dr. Kimon Joseph, collaborators remarks from Mr. Delwyn James, introduction of the presenter by Miss Karaya John Baptist, and an excellent lecture as well as an open discussion between Dr. Nicole Philip. Again, some background history of the doctor. Dr. Nicole Philip Dow is the Deputy Director of UE Global Campus Site. She joined the UE site or the UE team as head of the Grenada site in 2014. She has served in the field of education for over 30 years. She was a teacher at the St. Joseph Convent, a senior lecturer, and the Dean of the Department of Arts, Sciences and Professional Studies at T.A. Marischal Community College, and a part-time lecturer at the St. George's University. She has also authored and co-edited 6 books, including Women in Grenadian History, Perspectives on the Grenada Revolution in 1979 to 1983, Caribbean Social Studies, Book 2 and 3, History for Trinidad and Tobago, Forms 1, 2, and 3, Collins Junior History of Grenada. And as a witness here tonight, she has been very transparent and open, very jovial spirit, wealth of knowledge, but also down to earth in her presentation here tonight. So DBS News will now be taking our good nights as we were extremely blessed to bring this broadcast to the many viewers and listeners, and to everyone we say good night.